Today's going to be a little bit different. Um, for those of you who are new, let me explain what we usually do, and then how today and maybe next week will be different. Usually what we do here, this started, I don't know, what, 40 weeks ago, Andy? I mean, a long time ago. We started it as a way to chat during the whole COVID lockdown thing. And it's just continuing, which is wonderful. And so usually what I do is a very brief, spontaneous riff on something, no real prep, and then we just have Q&A and discussion. But today's going to be a little bit different because I think there's a massive elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. That was started to come to the surface last week with Ted's question about, you know, how do we deal with, as he put it, with the shit show in Washington. And so I think we need to talk about this, or I recommend that we do. So what I usually do, you know, I drafted the things I want to share with you. I literally just finished drafting my notes this morning, so I didn't really have time to polish things. And on one level, that's okay, because I think maybe the more kind of heartfelt, spontaneous thing would be helpful here, so I don't try to, you know, domesticize too much what's going on here. But if I don't get through all my notes today, that's fine. I want to allow plenty of room for discussion on this, and I'm going to give some guidelines for our discussion. And hopefully I'm interviewing Sharon Salzberg on Sunday, and I'm going to see if she wants to go here as well to really talk about what's happening. But one of the things I would recommend, and this is a little bit like connected to some of the suggestions I might have towards how to relate to what's happening on a daily basis, is I start every day with practice, I end every day with practice. And so what I recommend before we start to frame this, or almost in another way, unframe what's happening or recontextualize. Let's just do a 1 minute practice together. Of all the practices that we do, I think Tonglen is the most effective, the practice of sending and taking. My suggestion is, as we go through this material, which is so charged, that we even take a few minutes and I'll guide us through these, you know, these 1 minute, one breath meditation sessions, so that we just stay grounded with what's really happening in our bodies and what we're really feeling, and don't just get lost in conceptuality. This is a way to hit the pause button, hit the mute button when things just get too hot, to settle down. I wouldn't say internal rhetoric, but you get the idea. But let's start with 1 minute of Tonglen. I think many, there's an interesting word, many people, anybody, everybody knows. On the in-breath, through every pore of your body, you breathe in. Of course, it's not you. You're representative of the cosmos, so the cosmos is bringing it in. On every pore of your body, you bring in all the heavy, dark pain, discord that's happening. And with every out-breath, through every pore, you radiate goodness, peace, love, tranquility. I do Tonglen now more than I have because of everything that's happening. So for the next minute, with that very basic instruction, I think most people know this practice. Let's just do one minute of Tonglen together, and then I'll start with my little presentation, okay? I think these sorts of pause buttons are good for a couple of reasons. They keep us grounded in what's really happening within us. I'll be talking a little bit more about how we confabulate, catastrophize. And so they keep us a little bit somewhat centered, because when things go a little bit haywire like they are now, it's a loss of center, losing our seat. And also doing something like Tonglen reminds us, connects us to others, that we're not just doing our little precious gatherings, our little precious spirituality for escapist purposes. And I'm going to talk more about that, that we're fundamentally doing this to be of benefit. And so what does it mean to be of benefit, and how can we be of benefit? So as I go through my little riff here today, and again, I'm going to try to limit myself to like 40 minutes. So then we can, we can have discussion, because I think the Q&A and inviting you to share is important. As we go through what I have to say, and I also recommend this when you're listening to news. And often what I recommend around situations like this is that we listen not only to the peeps that we agree with. For instance, if you watch MSNBC, CNN, and the like, which I do, full disclosure, full disclosure, my bias is liberal Democrat. I voted for Biden. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I think most of you probably know that. But what I do is I do on occasion, and it is a challenge, is a type of reverse meditation. I listen to Fox News. I listen to Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and others. And I find it, first of all, extremely difficult to do. But if I can't listen to them, how can I ever hope to communicate? How can we ever even think about reconciliation and the end of the culture wars? And so as contracted as I get, as repulsed as I am, sometimes I have to hit the mute button. Sometimes I have to catch myself from throwing my shoe through the TV. I do that as a way to work with my own reactivity, my own contractions, my own aggression, my own anger, and also as a way to try to listen to something that is so disparate to the way I see things. So as I go through my little riff, a couple invitations. Notice what you feel. Notice if you find yourself feeling contracted, your heart rate going up, your blood pressure going up. If you do feel that, and I'm going to do this even for myself, if I start to notice myself getting a little bit riled up, I'm going to hit the pause button. We're going to do a one breath meditation. We want to feel these emotions. We're not trying to become emotionally sterile, aseptic, antiseptic. We want to feel what we're feeling, but my maxim is feel it, but don't feed it. Feel it, but don't feed it. Because if you feed it, then you lose contact, in my opinion. So if you find yourself getting riled up or even offended by some of what I'm going to say, you might also ask yourself, why? Why am I feeling this way? Is the information getting too close, too personal? Is it in fact challenging my comfort zone, my spiritual bubble bath? Am I feeling too vulnerable? And I also, when I work with this, I remind myself how reconstituting both anger and fear are. They're incredibly solidifying emotions. And it's very easy, I see this a lot in the death and dying business, it's very easy to default into anger when things are falling apart, because nothing makes me feel more solid than anger. And so if you find yourself getting angry, you might want to look at that. I'm going to talk a fair amount about anger, how to use it and not be used by it. This is a big part of what I want to riff on. How can we use this energy and not let it use us? How can we use it and not abuse it? And also along these lines, notice how quickly, again, I'm speaking about myself, how quickly I FedEx out of my body and into my conceptual mind, into conceptual proliferation, prapancha, and fundamentally just lose contact. So whenever you feel these kind of escapist, kind of uncontrolled contractions, pause, one breath, drop back into your body. And so when I was going through, I saw Ted's question last week. In all candor, I saw it on the list of questions, and I was avoiding it. He put it up there very early on, and I saw it, and I just didn't want to go there. And I looked at that. Even the avoidance at the time, and I'll show you a little bit more like why I didn't go there last week until the very end. But it has to do with what I want to talk about now, and that is that if we don't think, and again, I'm speaking very personally and directly here, if we don't think that meditation, spirituality can in fact meet the current social crisis, can meet politics, or in fact, if we don't feel that something like a meditative spiritual platform is not in fact the place to discuss really gritty, grimy, dirty things like even politics. First of all, if that's the way you feel, I actually honestly advise you to sign off. I won't be offended. Maybe it might be best to skip this in the next session. Because we're going to talk about some really charged stuff. And I think if we don't do that, of what value, of what relevance is our meditation, of what relevance is our spirituality? It absolutely positively catapults us into a cascade of near enemies and spiritual pathologies, some of which I'll be talking about, spiritual bypassing, which is absolutely epidemic. And so with some of these kind of initial comments and caveats, I'm going to speak with a little bit more directness than I normally do, and unapologetically. If it comes across as political, if you interpret it as divisive or even contentious, so be it. We can talk about it, but I feel it's time to be a little bit more, at least from my side, direct about what's going on and how we can use spiritual practice meditation as a way to skillfully engage what's happening instead of running away from it. So when I saw Ted's question last week, it's like, I didn't really want to go there. Part of it was for this reason. It's like, is this the right platform? Should we be talking about this? And the other thing is, I didn't think I was ready because the full impact of what happened, I mean, this thing happened a week ago Wednesday, we met Thursday. It was so surreal to me that I wasn't able to digest it. I turned on the TV and I thought, well, is this like an Independence Day sequel? Is this really happening? And it was so stunning that I literally couldn't grok it. I couldn't digest the magnitude of what has happened. And actually, it's continuing to happen. And so I avoided Ted's question because it's like, I'm not sure I know what to say here. I'm not necessarily in denial, but it's like, I'm not sure what to do with this. And so I've spent a lot of this last week. I had a wonderful conversation yesterday. David Loy and I went for a long walk. We spent most of the time talking about exactly this. In fact, I will share with you a wonderful 3-part meditation because I asked him, I said, David, what do you recommend when people ask you, what do you do with this? So I will share with you this little powerful 3-part guided meditation that he gave me. I'll share that with you. But it really took me a while to grasp the scope of this. And the more I digested it, the more repugnant, revulsive it became. I mean, literally physically nauseating, like I wanted to throw up. And it's absolutely positively Shakespearean in scope. I read this op-ed in the New York Times Review a number of years ago. It was brilliant. As you know, they're total liberal, and I mean, they're my peeps. They speak my language, and I think the New York Times Review is pretty brilliant. And I read this really interesting piece from a scholar who talked about how what's actually happening now is completely Shakespearean in its scope. And as you know, in most of Shakespeare's plays, the climax always comes at the end. It always gets worse at the end. The murder, the disaster, the drama always happens at the end. And so his comments were completely prescient. This could have been written 4 years ago. that the closer you get to the end, and the question is, will we in fact be at the end on the 20th? The more tragic it becomes. And boy, these words are really coming to bear. So I think it's time for us, at least for me, everything is relationship to me, how I feel, how I'm working with this, struggling with this, wrestling with this. This is one of the things that I've been working with for a while, is that there's a lot of conversation about, being PC, right? Being politically correct. I think, there's some validity to that. I don't think there's enough conversation about being SC, spiritually correct. And by this, what I mean, a little bit what I was talking about earlier, is this really profoundly damaging, fallacious notion that somehow it's anti-spiritual to get angry. That I've had criticism, believe me, leveled at me. People have literally come to me after a particular expression, and they said, well, that's not very Zen of you. You're not being Zen. I thought, literally, I had one person say, well, I thought you were more Zen than that. And another person on a different situation, these are all true stories. That's not very Buddhist of you. And boy, yeah, you can imagine what I almost said but didn't say. But my immediate response is, well, if that's really the way you feel, you don't know anything about Zen. You don't know anything about Buddhism. You are projecting your precious, sterile versions of spirituality and meditation onto me and onto the world. And somehow they're thinking spirituality is, this kind of archetype of the distance, this differentiated, dissociated, individual sitting in ultimate retreat, untouched by the issues of the unwashed masses, right? It's such a naive, immature spirituality, naive spirituality. Real spirituality has teeth. I mean, really solid guts. And we're going to be talking about that. So if your version, this is a question for you, if your version of meditation and spirituality is just really a form of metaphysical Valium, if you're just trying to sedate yourself, there's some provisional validity to that. This is a colossal near enemy, in my opinion, of the mindfulness revolution. I am going to be talking to Sharon about that because I'm writing a book on it. If you just want to feel good, there's provisional validity for that. There is a provisional validity for being sedated, pacified. That's where mindfulness will take you. But as I've said over and over, starting with my first book, The Power and the Pain, in my estimation, the spiritual path is not about feeling good, unless you're talking about basic goodness, completely expanded sense of foundational goodness. Spiritual path is not about feeling good, it's about getting real. And getting real means dealing with really difficult, thorny, earthbound issues, everything that we're seeing that's taking place in the world. And so I actually saw this quote just this morning. Let me read this to you. You'll see here, this is, I can't remember who wrote it because it was actually sent to me without attribution. I remember reading this. I can't remember where, so I can't attribute it, but you've probably heard variations of this, right? So here you go. From some spiritual master, no doubt. And again, there's some truth in here, but you'll also see a hornet's nest of near enemies here, at least in my opinion. So here's the quote. Always recognize the dreamlike qualities of life and reduce attachment and aversion. Practice good-heartedness towards all beings. Be loving and compassionate no matter what others are doing to you. What they will do will not matter so much when you see it as a dream. The trick is to have positive intention during the dream. Now, he's not just this person, this is me, not just talking about the nighttime dream, he's talking about this dream, right? The trick is to have positive intentions during the dream. This is the essential point. This is true spirituality. End quote. Well, is it really? Maybe this is part of true spirituality. If we run around in these raging forms of absolutistic thinking, absolute spiritual bypassing, And this is a colossal enemy with the stuff that I'm writing and riffing about: dream, nocturnal practices, dream yoga, illusory form, saying everything is a dream. It's a very dismissive comment that leads not to healthy differentiation, but to pathological dissociation. And so if this is your charter, I don't think this is true spirituality. I think it's part of it. It's part of the picture. Because otherwise things just become too anemic, in my opinion. So along those lines, again, pardon that this isn't particularly polished. I literally just threw these notes together this morning. I want to, before I talk about anger and how to work with it, spiritual bypassing and how to work with it, all the things that I've started to ping, I want to, again, maybe back up for just a second to recontextualize and set the right view. Because in many ways I'm trying to do that. I want to be a little bit more articulate here, because, you know, it's the eightfold, and the eightfold noble path right view is the first of the eightfold factors. It's really important so that then we contextualize, reframe what we're doing. Otherwise we lose our vision. We go non-lucid, and that, I mean, non-lucidity on a very, very deep level is absolutely what's happening now. People are just losing it. They're going completely non-lucid to what's happening in the world right now. So the right view that's applicable to us here, in my estimation, and I've been riffing on this for, if you've been paying attention to my stuff, for quite some time now, is that if you, I think, pay very close to the nature of reality, mind and its display, I have no doubt whatsoever, and I'm convicted on this, I'm writing about it, that you can reduce the vast, complex display of everything that happens in the world, and I mean everything, nothing is left out of this, to the spirit, to fundamental spiritual principles and tenets. Psycho-spiritual principles can explain everything, really. I believe this has ultimate explanatory power. And so that in itself is helpful to understand. And so what we are working with is, in fact, throughout the stuff I write on and riff on, we're working with these absolute irreducible aspects. But sometimes they're so foundational, they're so far down, they're so fundamental that the display that arises from that, it can no longer really be efficacious. These teachings on one level can become so subtle that it's like trying to stop a tank with a fly swatter. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit more about how we can use these incredibly elegant, beautiful, powerful explanatory teachings to inform everything we do. And then also translate into more skillful means that sometimes require even force, even, I mean, wrath. We're talking about real wrath. So the other thing I want to talk about are the four karmas, what they are, and in particular, the karma of destruction. There is a place, absolutely 100%, for wrath, for anger, and for destruction. It's in the tradition. But one of the most summary statements around this I heard from John Kabat-Zinn, I think it's just beautiful in its impact. And again, this is talking about the foundational aspect of what we're doing, when he says this: when you know the mind fully, you get beauty, the arts, and all things wondrous. When you don't know the mind fully, you get Auschwitz. And so really, on a very real level, again, everything that's taking place now, this super samsara on steroids, is because these individuals don't know the mind fully. And, you know, you get these inflammatory processes, Trumpism, literally Sam Harris now, who I like this guy. He's got a real cutting edge to him. He calls Trump derangement syndrome. I don't know if he made that up, but you get the idea. And so what is fundamentally happening here, absolutely positively, is indeed reduced to developmental issues, egoic inflammatory issues where ego itself is an arrested form of development. Everything can be reduced to these fundamental truths. And once we break away from these truths, once we break away from non-dual truths into duality, we enter the world of fake news. And everything we're seeing in these gross epiphenomenal expressions of fake news, even in the way the politicians are using them, 100% guarantee they can be reduced to these foundational fake news principles, the principles of duality altogether. And so I want to throw that into the mix, because on this level, what we are doing in our programs and our teachings, and so many other skillful people, we are dealing really very powerfully with everything that's happening in the world, but we're just working with it at levels that are so subtle, so foundational, so irreducible, that they in fact can be feel extremely removed from what's happening in the world. And so I think it's helpful to throw that into the mix. And so to return to this developmental thing, ego itself is a necessary part of human evolution. Fundamentally, ego doesn't really exist. It's an illusion, but we reify it, and it goes into what's called schismogenesis, or runaway. And then you get things like we're getting now. I mean, the classic diagnoses of what Trump is: a malignant narcissist, a xenophobe, misogynist, power mongerers, and all his cronies in Congress, and then all the army, 20 million in his army. I'll give you more specific numbers. These are the 20 million fanatics. These all reduce to basic egoic inflammatory processes. And so, King Donald, right, the emperor who fundamentally has no clothes, and some of these clothes are being stripped away with what Twitter and Facebook are doing. Good for them. King Donald and his Idiot's Republic of Trumpistan, I think that's the other term that's coming out, the Idiot's Republic of Trumpistan. The numbers here are really scary. Preaching to the choir here, but I want to say just a little bit in case you don't know. 74 million people, right? I think 74 million voted for him. He has 89 million followers, or he did, on Twitter. Some 20 million is what I'm hearing now. Literally, they call them the army of Trump. And this is a real serious thing. If you literally don't think, and I've been in denial about this, if you literally don't think that civil war is a real possibility here, you've got your head in the sand. And I have had my head in the sand as well. It's like, no, this can't happen here. But absolutely, positively, it can happen here. And we see these types of expressions that are, based on what we saw last week. I personally don't think it's going to stop at all. I think we are going to see more violence for sure. Lunatics, because these people are quite literally willing to kill and die for their cause. It's the phenomenology of runaway belief, the phenomenology of fanaticism, that when you reify things to that level, you are willing to kill and die for your beliefs. And some of the stuff that's happening, I mean, I don't need to go into all of it. We could talk endlessly by just be repeating what's happening on the news. Some of the stuff, the more the stuff that's coming out is increasingly disconcerting. 90% of Republicans still think the election was stolen, that democracy is really at risk. And from this is born, from these types of reified ideologies and true ultra fake news, is born fascism and nationalism and things like that. And if you think that somehow this world, Western world, is somehow immune from that, I think we're all kidding ourselves. I was listening to some conversations with some of these QAnon people. Really scary stuff. These folks who literally believe that many Democrats are, this is no exaggeration, are child raping cannibals. When you actually try to present them with the facts, as you know, they become extremely defensive, offensive, proclaiming that you're the one that needs to wake up. They're, in many ways, some people are saying these folks are unreachable. And these are the ones that are really quite terrifying. This is where, in my opinion, this is where I'm going for help in understanding this kind of mentality. We need the help of professionals, psychologists, sociologists, cultural anthropologists, people who really work with this type of thing, using history as their, kind of resource, their references. So the more I personally digest this, it's taken me days, because the shock is so intense for me. The intensity is so much, the more repugnant it is. And, you know, how am I going to deal with that? How am I going to work with that? What am I going to do? I'll share a little bit more personally about what I'm working with and how I'm dealing with it. But for us now, fundamental teaching of the Buddhist tradition is in fact impermanence. Everything ends. Roman Empire ended, civilizations ended. I've been to some of these great ruins, Mayan ruins, Angkor Wat, these great civilizations. And if we somehow in America, in our narcoticized culture, somehow feel that democracy can't end, we're kidding ourselves. And right now, Noam Chomsky, my friend David Loy said this, Noam Chomsky, you know, incredible student of the Western world, says we are living, he said this months ago, we are right now in the most dangerous point in the entirety of human civilization and history, right now. When I heard this from David several months ago, like many others, oh, that's just hyperbole. That's just, you know, people looking for a clickbait, looking for their sound bites. I don't think so anymore. What's happening here is really a catastrophe. And I run around often, you know, I work with this myself. I'm a kind of a minimalist. When people kind of lose it and they confabulate and they go into a runaway and they start to catastrophize, I often find myself coming in as a minimizer. No, it's really not that bad. I've really had to work with that propensity now because I have been minimizing what's happening. It's definitely a catastrophe what's taking place, literally. And so one breath meditation, one sit meditation for me. And now I want to get a little bit more, connect this to a fundamental problem that I see within myself and I see in spiritual communities, spiritual bypassing. I want to talk a little bit about spiritual bypassing. This is a term that was coined by brilliant psychologist John Wellwood. He kind of, in a certain sense, was riffing on what Trungpa Rinpoche talked about, spiritual materialism. Spiritual bypassing is a kind of a subset of spiritual materialism. I'm doing a lot of study research on this right now because I'm going to be presenting, I think, some stuff even with David Loy on this. And so I want to read to you, excuse me, a definition of this term from a psychologist, Robert Augustus Masters, who wrote a book by this title, Spiritual Bypassing, When Spirituality Disconnects Us from What Really Matters. And so this is a good book. I wouldn't say it's a great book. It's a good book. Again, who am I to say? First part, I think, is really good. So this is the way he defines it. And then we're going to riff on this a little bit. And then we're going to talk about anger and how to use anger. And that anger is not at all anti-spiritual. Anger has a place. So this is the way he defines it. Spiritual bypassing is a very persistent shadow of spirituality, manifesting in many forms, often without being acknowledged as such. Aspects of spiritual bypassing include exaggerated detachment, emotional numbing and repression, overemphasis on the positive, anger phobia, blind or overly tolerant compassion, weak or too porous boundaries, lopsided development, cognitive intelligence often being far ahead of emotional and moral intelligence, debilitating judgment about one's negativity or shadow side, devaluation of the personal relative to the spiritual, and delusions of having arrived at a higher level of being. That's pretty good. Boy, that's pretty good. That covers a lot of territory, and to me has a tremendous amount of explanatory power. I mean, when I read this stuff, and this is kind of jumping ahead to part of my prescription, at least I'm working with it, is like checklist. Okay, does this apply to me? Right? Check, check, check. Oi, oi, vey. Spiritual bypassing, busted, busted. So this is not only a very interesting kind of intellectual topic for me, this is a very personal topic for me that I work really intensely with this now. You know, it's very often we see in others what we don't see in ourselves. What am I not seeing? What am I not seeing? How am I contributing to what's happening? Is my silence being complicit? And so working with this stuff is not easy. Blind spots, by definition, are blind spots. They're really hard to see. And all these people that are doing what they're doing, I promise you, just like Hitler and Pol Pot, many of these other folks, they did what they thought was right. They were willing to fight, kill, die because they were so convicted in what they're doing is the right thing to do. I mean, really think about it. If you drink the Kool-Aid and feel that this democracy is being stolen, the election is stolen, what would you do? And so these people that have reified this without, not willing to open and challenge what they're feeling, they solidify. And then from that brought about these extremely offensive and defensive reactivities. So there is a place, let's talk now about how all this relates to anger. In this kind of anti-spiritual, ridiculous notion that anger somehow is not applicable. There is a place, absolutely 100%, on the spiritual meditative path for tough love, for anger. Wrathful compassion is not an oxymoron. It has a place. Doctrinally, to put it into contexts, let me just talk very briefly about the 4 karmas. These are very interesting kind of terminology because they're 4 acts. Karma literally means action. The 4 karmas actually, when they're performed purely, are actions that don't create karma. And so what this therefore means, if it's done properly, wrathful anger, wrathful activity actually can be karma-free if it's driven from pure impulses and pure motivations, and that's the key. So the 4 karmas, we don't have time to unpack all 4 of them, an extremely powerful set of teachings. The karmas themselves are pacifying, that's the first approach, enriching, magnetizing, and destroying. And Trungpa Rinpoche talked a lot about this, and there was one quite famous example of it. I wasn't there, but people who I know were there, where Trungpa Rinpoche went through these 4 karmas. I don't think he was talking about them, but he actually manifested them in the course of this particular event. He was teaching as it was conveyed to me, teaching in a live session. And there was a person in the audience that really started to lose it, got up, stood up, and started to unload on Rinpoche. And Rinpoche went through the 4 karmas, tried to pacify him, tried to engage him, worked through the enriching, brought him forth, magnetizing. And then after a relatively brief period of time, he quickly determined that these 3, I wouldn't say provisional karmas, they're not provisional. These 3 first karmas were not efficacious enough. They weren't getting the job done. And so he unleashed the 4th karma. He had these little kind of, they're called kasung kusung, these dharma protectors, these kind of, you could say dharma protectors of truth. I don't want to say, like military police, but they're people there to just ensure the environment. Very, very brilliant way that Trungpa Rinpoche even used military, which is about the most anti-spiritual thing you can think of. His genius was to even bring military principles within the spiritual arena. And so he lashed out and ordered the Kasung forcefully, wrathfully, to get that mofo the F out of there. And so he cascaded through all 3, and then they weren't working. So he went, not right to it, but he cascaded through and engaged the wrathful karma. And so, they're always in a philosophical, bring it back to a little bit of philosophical principles. There's often discussions about these sorts of things. Here's one extreme example. This is a kind of a koan in philosophy, in morality and studies of ethics. Like if you're in a room with Adolf Hitler and you have the opportunity to take him out, what do? You take him out. And you read the literature. There's so many stories of the previous lives of the Buddha where he, one instance he killed in his previous life, he killed a person who he knew was about to kill all these people and sink the ship. And so this is what Robert says about anger. Robert Augustus Master says about anger. And this incredible trap that I see in the spiritual community and also within myself. So I'm talking very personally here about the near enemy of a kind of emotional asceticism or even emotional celibacy, where we think, oh, I can't get angry, right? This is not being spiritually correct. It has no place. Well, bullshit. It totally has a place. So this is what Robert says. We can treat anger as an ally, an enemy, an inconvenience, a regressive activity, a resource, a means of aggression, or a means of deepening intimacy. It's our choice. We're not here to outgrow anger, but to outgrow our dysfunctional ways of using it. And this begins with knowing anger well. And then he goes on to say in a really powerful way, anger is moral fire. Whether it is destructive or constructive is in our hands and in our hearts. It all depends on how we relate to this energy. In and of itself, again, situating it in Dharma lingo, this is the energy of the Vajra family that is cutting, incisive, clear. And this particular avenue has its, again, it has its bandwidth of applicability. And so the appropriate relationship is really the issue. How do we, in fact, engage this energy properly? How can we relate to it instead of from it? It's also interesting, kind of doctrinally, that of the 100 and peaceful, wrathful deities that represent the archetype of the awakened mind, there are more wrathful deities than there are peaceful deities. So if you do the math on that, working with wrath, working with aggression, not being afraid of confrontation, whether it's individual or in this case, social, standing up, saying no. And this is the other thing, especially with all the meditations I've been teaching on open awareness, the power of saying yes, the power of radical acceptance. I'm not criticizing it at all. When we're working with our own mind and heart, we're working with our own experience. We really do, it's extremely helpful to work with unconditional yes. I'm perfect just the way I am, like Suzuki Roshi says. He says, you're perfect just the way you are. Or what do you say? We're all perfect just the way we are, but we could each use improvement. It's fantastic. So on one level, when we work within, radical acceptance, unconditional love for ourselves is absolutely true. But there's also a place for the big fat no. In fact, Trungpa Rinpoche wrote a very powerful article. I think it's literally called The Big No, where, again, these energies come into play, setting boundaries, being wrathful, expressing anger without being aggressive. And even there, it's interesting, the etymology of the word aggression literally means, literally means to step forward. It just depends on how you're going to step forward. Like now, how do we step forward? So even aggression fundamentally is not inherently problematic. So for us, and then I'll give you some really practical things. This is all laying the groundwork for what I hope will be a fruitful discussion today and maybe next week. Well, what do we do with all this stuff? And there's so much more to say, but for today, I want to allow opportunities for you to speak. Can we, in fact, in a tantric way, an alchemical way, use what's happening, transform obstacle into opportunity? Well, we can, but we have to be careful because, as I mentioned before, starting with the virus, studies have shown that when things fall apart, the default is actually regressive. It's not progressive. So we have to really, really examine what regressive and mostly reactive relationships are versus progressive, responsive relationships. And so connected to this is what I'm reading a book now. Many of you probably read it, a classic book by biologist Bruce Lipton called The Biology of Belief. I highly recommend this book. Really tour de force on the biology of epigenetics, super interesting things. And Bruce is a really pretty clever guy, and he talks about there how it is that actually crisis ignites evolution. And what exactly is that evolution? And how can we engage in it? It all depends on how we relate to it. Everything is about proper relationship to what's happening in the world, relationship to our own interior landscape, how we can relate to things instead of from them. And then from that more, and this is where spirituality and psychology are critically important, where we can step into the world not completely lost in our projections. I mean, if we don't do some cleaning up at home, we are just plastering the world, which we're doing all the time, with projections. And so when we step into the world, how do we know if we're really cleaning it up or just further adding pollution? That's where the inner work comes in, before really we work with the outer work. So I do think that there is a lot of, I mean, some people, including Bruce, I listened to this entire thing on what was called the Earthkeeper Summit, 5, 6 speakers, including Bruce Lipton, talking about what's happening in the stage. This obviously was released before last week's crap show, about how these speakers were genuinely excited about what's happening using dissipative theories of, related to chaos and complexity theory, dissipative structures. There's all kinds of physical, metaphysical, even scientific principles that can help us understand what's happening here. That very often, before light breaks, it's always the darkest. So I want to leave you with a couple of things that I'm working with, and then let's talk about this. Again, there's so much to say, but let me just say a couple of things like, okay, well, what do we do with all this? Well, let me tell you what I'm doing, how I'm working with it. And I'd love to hear what you all are doing with this. So what do you do? Well, on one level, of course, it's up to us. Do we default into indoctrinated, ingrained, habitual karmic patterns? Again, those are generally regressive. Or do we look at these things authentically, honestly, painfully, and in an exploratory way, discover our roles in what's happening, and therefore do the necessary work that allows us to step forward properly? I start and end, like I mentioned earlier, one thing that's critically important for me is I start and end every single day with meditation, because it creates this larger framework for me, this larger context where I hold my day within the embrace of space, within the embrace of wisdom, kindness, compassion, and love. If I don't do that, I go non-lucid. I just lose it during the day. I get swept up, I get lost, I get really pissed off. What good is that going to do? So for me personally, meditation is key. It helps me recontextualize, helps me see more properly, helps me unframe and reframe everything within this larger, truer embrace. Because, excuse me, whether it's 50 years, 100 years, even a bigger topic, will we even be here in 100 years? I don't even know anymore. But if the civilization continues for 100 years, we will look back upon this with the lens of the perspective of time. Einstein showed us that space and time are inseparable. We don't have the luxury of waiting 100 years, but space, the inseparability of space-time, you work with space, that can create the perspective of time. So I step in and then I step out. I get my 50,000-foot view. I try to look down from philosophical, psychological, spiritual, developmental principles and tenets. I hold it that way. But the kick is then I don't stay up there. Then I come back. And then for me, it's a very active, open question. What more can I do? So I work with this kind of multi-layered approach because I'm a multi-layered being. But what I take refuge in is this larger, open, spacious wisdom embrace. From that open stance, I find myself much less reactive, more responsive, more open, more able to touch into my own reactivities. And therefore, I can communicate with my family, who I love to death, but are hardcore. They still support Trump. It's staggering challenge for me. I love my family, but they are hardcore Trumpsters. How am I gonna ever see them again? Part of me just says, I don't want anything to do with you, right? And the minute I feel that, I'm going, well, wait a second, this is my blood. These are my peeps on one level. How can I be with them? How can I relate to them? How can I, connect to them? So I work with that. I can't do that if I don't have this larger framework. I mean, I'll just unload on them the way they unload on me, right? So, and so also, again, what role do I have? Is Trump, in fact, symptom or a cause? Both. Both. He's a colossal cause. There's no doubt about it. He needs to go away like yesterday. He needs to be taken out like right now. But the good news, painful as it is the diagnostic component that he is symptomatic of this underlying dis-ease that is now just raging to the surface. And again, from a 50,000-foot view, no coincidence that, or not a coincidence, I should say, that the epidemic is reaching its absolute crescendo. I mean, could you ask for anything more Shakespearean? We just need a comet to come by. Actually, that probably could help right now, honestly. If a comet was coming this way, that actually could help, because then we'd all unify against the effing comet. So we need a bigger enemy. But, really at this point, let's just have a couple asteroids come down. I mean, really, it's like, what? Bring it on. Like, what else can we possibly get? At this point, talk about Shakespearean, right? So what is my part in this? What am I not seeing? I try to work with the energy, and I'm working with it even now. As this stuff comes up, I find my heart rate going up. I take a breath. I slow down. I connect to what I'm feeling here. Because otherwise, just like the idiots that stormed the Capitol, I'm going to lose it. And what good is that? If I can't hold my seat, how can I actually work with others? Again, personally, for me, media diet, news diet. When the stuff first broke, I was like everybody else, who maybe doesn't have a job. I was watching this crap 4, 5, 6 hours a day, because it's a little bit like ambulance chasing. On one level, it's like, oh my gosh, it's like perversely entertaining. And then after a while, that toxicity, I don't know how people like Rachel Maddow and all these people live in this world. I don't know what kind of purification practices allow them to do what they're doing. It's so toxic. So for me, media diet, I personally, just me, I limit what I take in to an hour these days, because otherwise I get obsessive. I just get so sucked into it. That's not healthy. So I stay away. And I also realize if I get too involved, I'm giving people like Donald Trump and all these other idiots more power. I am actually being shenwonged. I am actually empowering them with a power that boomerangs, and then they have more power over me. They actually start to control me. And I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to maintain my control, my rigor. So maybe I'll talk a little bit more next week about what really needs to happen. I recommend you listen to 2 interviews, the recent night interviews, 2 podcasts. Sam Harris, he's another, I listened to his stuff. He also inspired me to do what I'm doing now. He released a podcast this week and last week where I 100% agree with virtually everything he says. Just brief parenthetical interjections there. Absolutely. This is, again, I didn't polish any of what I'm presenting to you. Larger scope, absolutely diminish the power of the executive branch so it doesn't have this potential for perversion. Increase election transparency and security so people can actually have trust in the election. There's so many practical things that can be done that we can help with, that we can call our congressmen and our senators. Just pick up the phone and call them. You can actually get involved in this type of change. And I want to leave you. Again, I have more to say, but I want to converse with you. Transition this sometimes potentially sterile view of bodhisattva activity to what my dear friend David Lloyd talks about as eco-sattva, or in this case, political sattva. How can we use these incredibly powerful spiritual tenets to save democracy? Isn't it amazing that I'm even saying that? To save the planet. How, if we can't use, again, what we're doing here, in my opinion, it's irrelevant. Of what benefit? You know, why not just take a Valium, drink a beer, and watch a football game, right? This real body self activity it means engaging these types of things. So I'll say more next week about, I just have notes to myself, more specific things, not falling into single action bias. There's obviously a whole cascade of things I want to cover. Oh, I'm already over time. But I want to leave you with this reflection from my friend David Loy. He shared with me, because I asked him, I said, David, what are you recommending? And he shared with me this 3-part meditation. So I'm going to share it with you. I just find it really helpful. And then we can talk about this. And because this is such a big topic, and I hope I didn't race through it too quickly, we're definitely going to come back to this next week, because I hate to say it, this is not over. You know, this is not over. So more later. But 3 things. Number 1, reflect on your own situation, your capacities, what you have to bring and to offer. In other words, there are both limitations and blessings to things like our age, our health. This is all David stuff. Our age, our health, our abilities, our station in life, our skills, our training, education, all the resources that we have. So when I asked David, you know, like, what do you do? And he goes, well, the first thing I recommend is I don't give hardcore prescriptions, even though I think there's some validity to doing that. Mostly he basically, in good spiritual way, saying, do this work for yourself, figure it out on your own. Again, this is going to be super interesting to talk to Sharon Salzberg about on Sunday. And I'm going to release this talk ASAP, as soon as Monday, because her latest book is called Real Change. And I'm going to talk to her in this context about, you know, Sharon's a real senior voice. Real change at this level. What does it mean? How do we do it? So this is the start of a series of things I want to share with you. So number 2, reflect on the possibilities available to you in the situation you are in. Location, where you live or where you could live, the problems that you're facing. So for instance, this political thing, or things like fracking, things like pollution, things like, I mean, like no shortage of things to choose from, right? What else does it say here? Reflect on your network of contacts, your connections, things that you can actually engage, your particular skill set. What can you bring? And then the third thing he says, and he says most important, open up, listen, meditate. What tugs at your heart? What tugs at your heart?